Keith and I are buying a beachfront property in Hawaii.
Yes.
And you're invited, Ed.
Lakefront in Tennessee, so I can represent you.
Fine.
Okay,
we're
fine.
buying a lakefront property in Tennessee.
I do like Nashville.
Keith, fine. We're buying a beautiful place in downtown Nashville. And you're meeting with us. First question, mandatory buyer rep agreement, and we're looking for an agent. Start us off there. What is your conversation about how we're going to work with Mr. Ed Zorn?
You talk about it privately, we talk about it publicly. This is the Real Estate Insiders Unfiltered Podcast. Welcome again to the Real Estate Insiders Unfiltered Podcast. I'm your host, James Swiggins, along with my co-host, Mr. Crazy Uncle Keith.
Yes, I finally just got my normal intro.
I know. But hey, we had our number one frequent flyer. He's got all the hotel points and airline points possible. So tell everybody who was on the pod and what we talked about, because this is probably the most important podcast we have done to date.
Yes. If you're a listener to the pod, we had Ed Zorn, who you know has been on before many times. And you asked, we listened. The number one question we get asked when we talk about this out in the field or with anyone is, what should I say when this happens? What should I say when that happens? How should I change my listing presentation? How should I change my buyer consultation? So we thought, let's get Ed on the pod and let's actually have those discussions. So we will have for you the conversation live and in real time as if we were talking to clients. This is the number one asked for podcast that we've been urged to put together. So we did it. You're going to love it.
All the objections sellers might ask you, all the objections buyers might ask you. We role played it, the three of us. It was good
stuff.
Good stuff. Tune in.
Put it in yours, kids.
Ed, welcome back to the podcast. You've got rewards points and frequent flyer miles at this point.
We have to come up like at your 10th visit, you get at least a t-shirt or something.
Yeah.
Like, and
You
you're
guys
in the
sent me a
lead.
really cool hat that I got.
We did.
Right?
Yeah,
So
yeah,
that's good. So I
yeah.
got a little bit of swag.
Yeah.
We did. You did get you get merch hat. We're working on a merch stuff for everybody and all the crazy things that are said on the podcast. So a little different for me this morning. I'm an idiot and had some headphone issues. So we're doing it the old school way. Keith's the only one that's professional this morning. But per use, that's right. But we have a lot to cover. And, I don't think we need to go through who you are and your background. People are pretty familiar with you at this point. I wanted to dive right in because we wanted to get through the main point of this pod is, handling objections from buyers and sellers in this post-August 17th world. You have been, pretty much dead accurate on all of your predictions and have been, doing this sort of post-August 17th world business anyway. So we thought it'd be really good to actually just role play with you and ask all the questions as buyers and sellers directly to you and how you would respond, with the hopes that this helps brokerages and agents better be prepared for this new, very fast approaching reality.
And just in case the audience wants the whole autopsy timeline, we'll put in the show links. Ed's been on several times. We had him on before the settlement, right after the settlement. So if you wanted to hear the whole Ed playlist, we'll link to it in the show notes if you wanted to do an autopsy on how
I
we
would
got
recommend
here.
doing all that in one sitting.
No,
That's a little much at once.
Or grab an adult beverage.
Yeah.
Or
a long road trip. But there's a lot of good content in there if you want to listen to the whole thing.
All right, let's start in on some of the headlines. Even this morning, there's some headlines that are already out about the DOJ. We know that NAR met with the Department of Justice. We also know that some CIDs, some civil investigative demands, have been issued. We know at least California Association of Realtors. I've heard rumors of others that are receiving them. Can you give us a little bit of background on your thoughts or insights into why these are happening? And it came out in Kevin Sears' comments, specifically the DOJ is looking at forms, which you've also been vocal about. So give us a little bit of background on that.
And since these CID things are getting tossed around a lot right now, if you could also just give us a glossary term on what that CID means. Is.
Right. A CID is short for Civil Investigative Demand. And it's the subpoena power of the federal government, right, to be able to get information about a particular topic from a company or an entity or a person that's not involved in any kind of active litigation with the government at that moment in time, right?
Gotcha.
So it's a very typical thing. It may be a precursor to further action, or there may be no action and you may not be a target at all. You just happen to be the holder of some information that the Department of Justice needs to analyze in helping them with an ongoing investigation. We know the DOJ has been freed from these terms of the settlement agreement that they had entered into with NAR back in 2020. So the civil investigative demand isn't necessarily that you're a target, but that you hold some important information that the Department of Justice wants to obtain to review on an ongoing investigation. And the Department of Justice is now allowed to investigate and continue an investigation that they started way back in 2019 with regard to NAR's commission issues and the clerk cooperation policy. So I think this is related to that ongoing investigation. And I think the issue specifically with the forms, guys, is, look, the MLS has delivered to the Department of Justice through the NAR settlement and the practice changes everything possible that a multiple listing service could do as it relates to our MLS rules to stop the process of offers of compensation and commission sharing. Okay. We've done what we can at the MLS level. So now it's falling on the forms. And the issue here is if you keep in standardized forms, right, which are created when 20 competitors get into a room and agree to forms, which are great. They're great for consumers. Standardized forms save consumers lots of money. It means they don't have to go to lawyers. All that's great. So forms that are standardized by the industry are fantastic and great for the consumer. However, there's this risk of, will the offers of compensation remain? Will the criticisms and what caused the alleged conspiracy continue through the forms mechanism? And now, instead of it being on the multiple listing service that I see an offer of comp, what happens is I just make a phone call and I go, what's your offer of compensation? And if I don't hear a certain number, do I, as a buyer's agent, then not show that property? And then does that fact further used by listing agents to tell sellers, hey, if we don't share commissions at this certain minimum rate, when I get a phone call and I don't say X number, then someone may not show your property. We're in the exact same boat we are today.
And that gives them the ability to say that there's steering occurring, essentially.
Exactly. You keep the risk of steering alive if there's any kind of sharing of commissions between the brokers.
Mm-hmm. So if there wasn't standardized forms, would this be less of an issue for an antitrust claim?
Certainly, if each individual brokerage firm was making their own decisions, it would be much harder to allege that conspiracy, that concerted action, that agreement or understanding amongst competitors. And I would suggest to you, even if the standard forms dropped commission sharing and there was no sharing in the standard forms, if that's a business model that you still want to engage in, then you could just make your own form. It's the concerted action. It's a group of a bunch of brokers getting into a room voting on what the language of the form should be. That would be the basis of some kind of allegation of an agreement, concerted action, or understanding of the group.
So let me just do this in crayon for myself, okay? Like we'll do this really like Neanderthal level ability to process. So basically, the individuals or entities that are out there trying to find a workaround or a way to do it, it feels like there's a lot of energy, people trying to figure out how to do it the old way. And like you're just setting yourself up. What I heard you say is if you're trying to figure out how to do it the old way with some clever manipulations or not so clever, something as simple as a phone call, you're probably going to open yourself up to risk and trouble in the future. Is that
potentially, to the extent that you're using something that's industry created? Yes. Versus doing it on your own with your own creation, there's certainly a more significant risk. I think you'll probably also lose market share, and there's really no reason to do it.
Yeah.
But
now, for which we're going to get to in a minute, because we'll talk about. There's actually, you've been on record, and so have Keith and I, saying there's actually no reason to do it anyway.
Yes.
Which we're going to get into quite deeply here.
But I do understand the agent, right? The human being who's just trying to represent someone in helping them get their home. they aren't asking so that they can look. Do I think it's ever happened? Of course. Do I think it happens at scale? I do not personally, right? Where someone will choose to not show a property based off of a commission. So if an agent is just trying to figure out how to craft and curate their offer in the same way that it's common to call a listing agent and say, hey, what's important to your seller? Sometimes they want a longer close because they want to finish the school year. Sometimes they want to get an extended rent back so they don't feel pressure to pack really fast. Right. Like, so at what point am I asking the wrong question or the right question? Because I'm just trying to craft the perfect offer as best I can so my client, the buyer, can win. And how do I deal with that tension between the two? Like if I call someone and say, hey, tell me what's important to your seller, and then they just start to tell me about the commission, I just hang up in their face. Like, how do I manage this as someone who just wants to help someone through this transaction?
Yeah, and I think we'll probably get a lot of that in the buyer role play.
Yeah, okay.
Of how a buyer's agent would do that. I would say if that's part of the goal here, I would say let's wait and
okay.
I will craft those answers really well in that framework.
Okay.
I have a question, and then we'll get into those really quickly here. So, what about states that have had commission sharing in their forms for a while? Like my understanding is, for example, Texas has been doing that forever. I could be wrong, by the way. Someone from Texas can tell me otherwise, but I read some comments. People say we've had that in our forms for a long time. If this becomes, I'm going to paraphrase. I believe, from what I'm understanding and reading, like everybody else that's following this, is that the DOJ wants the spirit of the settlement to be followed. So these comments that Keith made about these alternative websites that are showing up are trying to sort of figure a way around it. Which, by the way, don't do that.
Yeah.
And this potentially commission sharing in forms with the DOJ is specifically stated they're looking at that, at least from the stuff that I saw from NAR. How does that play in with the fact that there's states that have been doing this for a long time? Is that now a practice that has to change potentially? Like, I know you're not their lawyer, but like, what's your take on that?
Yeah, it's going to be very difficult for the DOJ to maintain any kind of action where people are complying with state mandated forms. Right. It's a huge uphill battle for the Department of Justice. I think
why? Just because of the sheer volume?
No, the states have rights.
Yeah.
Right. The DOJ may not like that, but the states still have rights to do things with regard to contracting and the police powers to regulate the protect the consumers inside their own state the way that the state feels. Right. And so there's lots of legal issues and challenges. And I think what the DOJ has to wrestle with is where is a step too far. Right. And I think what you're describing here and try to tell a state on what they should do, that's usually, generally speaking, a step too far. The real question, I think, is more the forms of those states that don't have those regulations. I think that's where the DOJ will focus their energy and see how those elements might change first and deal with the state mandated forms kind of for another day.
Okay. All right. Well, let's jump into a lot here because the purpose of this is sort of objection handling. I think everybody can agree that it's funny. I was in an Uber yesterday and the Uber driver happened to be a realtor. It was actually a great conversation and we were just talking about some stuff and she's doing what she can to make ends meet right now. Because obviously the market's tough, and we brought up the lawsuit stuff and it was so apparent to me that they have absolutely no idea what is going to happen on August 17th. I mean, just like she had absolutely no concept of what decoupling was going to be in the MLS, and she worked for a very large real estate company. And I get that. We have a lot of people in our company too, and they don't all read the stuff we send. But so you've been very clear about this sharing of commissions just don't need to happen anymore in this new consumer-centric model. So let's dive into this of like post August 17th, the way that this really should operate. And let's just start as, Keith and I are the seller. We're selling our beach pad somewhere that we really want to own together. And you're the listing agent. let's just start with like, how do you start the conversation? And then I know Keith and I will ask you and bombard you with a bunch of questions to see how you respond to it. So
sure. So my plan as an active agent, when I go to take a listing in the consumer-centric model, would be to talk about my services, my 20-year experience, the more than 1,000 properties that I've, dealt with, explain to you my marketing plan, all the things that normally are part of your listing presentation. Okay. And then what I'm going to explain is the way that my listing agreement form would be crafted would be, we're only going to talk about the commission that I charge you. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to explain to you, okay, hey, James and Keith, I charge X percent. And for this X percent that you're going to pay me, here are the list of services I'm going to provide, and I'm going to market your property, those kind of things. And now we're going to transition. I'm going to say, now, it is in your best interests as sellers if the buyer has quality representation. We are more likely to close on time. You're more likely to close with a buyer that has a good loan, with an agent that understands how to negotiate, how to deal with inspections, how to deal with appraisals, where you want there to be an agent for the buyer. And under this new way that we're handling commissions moving forward, is the buyer is going to enter into a contract with their own agent to pay their own agent a certain amount. So we don't have to be concerned with or worried about what that buyer and that buyer agent has agreed to. In fact, we don't know what the buyer is paying the buyer's agent today as we're meeting here in your, really nice living room with a view of the ocean here. We don't know. So you only are committing to pay me my fee. And what's really going to happen in this kind of home that we're in right now, it is most likely that the buyer is going to need help financing the commission that buyer is going to pay their own agent. And the way that commission gets financed is we roll that commission into the transaction. And so then now I'm going to transition, and my conversation is going to focus on the CMA that I prepared. And just to throw some numbers out, hey, gentlemen, look, okay, here are 3 properties, and they all sold for $1 million. Okay. And let's assume that home one offered some kind of either compensation offer or concession that I can see in the multiple listing service at X, one at Y, and one at Z. Okay. So what I'm going to talk to you about in the CMA is I'm going to make an adjustment in my CMA when I present you with the comparable properties. And we're going to see that not a single seller received $1 million, even though that's the number you see on the top. Mm-hmm. And we're going to talk about, now, how do we want to market this property? What's our best strategy for this property in light of where we are in the marketplace? And now this part of the conversation is going to be very different depending on the type of property and what kind of market conditions we're in.
Right.
Okay. If this is an FHA property in Riverside County in Southern California in May of 2023, right, I can tell you, right, that 64% of the FHA loans deals that close with an FHA loan, 64% provided a offer of compensation at 2.1% and additional concessions at 1.8%. So if you have an MLS, let's assume our MLS in our fact pattern here has a concession. Let's say it's CRMLS, right? We can talk about the strategy of whether or not to try to encourage a buyer to come to your property, that we want to let them know that you are a willing seller, that you understand this dynamic, that the buyer's going to need help financing their commission or other costs to get into the property. So now we're going to have a conversation about concessions and whether you want to provide an advertising tool for concessions.
All right. Can I hold you right there for a second? Because I just want to pin a few things.
Me too.
What you stated was you're going to have a conversation about market condition and essentially potential likely buyer for the property, and you're tailoring your presentation around what that potential buyer and that market is. So for example, buyer's market, call it a normal market, and a seller's market. You're saying you're going to adjust the strategy based upon that. Did I understand that correctly?
Yes,
One other clarification, not only type of market, but also type of property, right?
Type of property, correct. If it's
Right.
an FHA, VA type entry-level property, I may have some different recommendations for you than if it's the third
Luxury,
or fourth
yeah.
move-up home,
Mhm.
an executive neighborhood, and I'll have a completely different recommendations if it's a high-end luxury property.
Right.
Right.
And
So different situations depending on what type of buyer we're trying to attract.
the other piece that I really enjoyed about your approach is you use the comps and the data in the comps to tell the story about that there are these other properties that have offered a commission. There are these other properties that had a concession. You're sort of taking the emotion out of it and letting the data and the facts speak. I mean, James and I have been saying this in some iteration for a while. Yesterday, it was about the seller's net. Today, the seller cares about their net. And 100 years from now, the seller is going to care the most about their net, right?
Correct.
And you're using the comps, which is a normal process that we use doing a CMA. You're just elucidating or shining a light on different parts than we used to help them understand the fact that what matters is your net. And so that I hope people got that, because that was brilliant.
Totally. And I want to just, we're going to do a lot about offer strategy and things in a minute too. I just want to, because we'll jump to that. I know we got a few more to do on this, but if the seller is saying, because this is what all the agents are thinking that are listening to this. Well, what if my seller doesn't want to do anything?
So they don't want to offer anything, right? No problem.
I don't want to pay the buyer's agent. I don't want to pay. I don't want to do consent. I screw the agent.
Sure, no problem. So you see these properties right here, and that where they got $1 million, or I should say they sold for $1 million, and no one got that. Let's net it out.
Right.
So I'm going to remove any offer of comp. I'm going to remove any concessions amount that were provided, and I'm going to say no problem. Then what we need to do, your based on how you want to structure the deal as the seller, then here's your list price. And I'm going to say right there, please be very careful of an agent who comes in after me, who may suggest to you, you can get that top price and offer different terms, because that's usually not how it works. And again, this is where we're going to be market sensitive. If it's a hot seller's market, you might be able to get away with that.
Yeah.
Right. But if it's a buyer's market, and you really want to sell this home sometime in the next, 2-3 months, then you helping a buyer may have an impact.
I want to ask one other question here, because I think this is really important, because you're separating the markets. If it's a buyer's market, if I understood you correctly, you're going to be essentially talking to the seller about being smarter about how you market your house to the buyer to get a buyer to look at this particular property, because they've got pick of the litter, got tons of houses, very few buyers, the buyer's in charge, just for clarity, right? So you're going to have a different conversation. You're going to have a different, and what you're saying, if I heard you correctly, is the seller's market, where seller's in control, 2021, there would be a different strategy, which, if I understood correctly, is maybe that you don't advertise anything. What would the language be? How would you, because what I want to make sure people understand is you don't want the seller to close themselves off from offers. So if they decided they didn't want to do an offer of compensation and or concessions, how would you market that so that you're still bringing as many buyers to the table? Does that question make sense?
It does. So what we're doing is we're now marketing on price, which is a very legitimate marketing strategy. This is a very valid strategy, right? We're going to go to market with the lowest price possible and try to drive as much traffic into your home as possible. And I'm going to tell you as a seller, what we're going to tell buyers to do is, if you need any kind of help from the seller, go ahead and put it in your offer and adjust your price.
Ed,
right? And so we're putting control back in the hands of the buyer. Hey, we don't know what you need out of this deal. Put it in there, make the offer. And we're gonna go off of a driving traffic strategy. Now, don't assume for a moment when I said we're in a buyer's market that I mean make a higher offer of concession, because I don't.
Right.
I actually would go with the lowest price and tell the buyer to put it in.
So
in a buyer's market, because I want to be as low as possible.
Look, I guess, and I am a dramatic oversimplifier, right? So, but again, prior to all this noise, when someone would call, you would say, "Hey, write your best offer," right? I mean, that was a pretty common response. They would say, "Yeah, they just want all the money they can get and as fast to close as possible," or they might give you a couple other terms that were important from a life of a seller standpoint. And then after that, you'd say, "Write your best offer," right? And again, to me, if you just have the conversation with the seller, "Hey, seller, listen, if someone brought you an offer for $1,050,000, but they asked you to pay some of the commission, but you netted more than an offer that was $900,000 but no commission, which one would you accept, Mr. or Mrs. Seller?" Well, the one that netted you more. Cool. Let's figure that out on offer day. Be open to whatever will get you the highest net. That's what I want you to be open to, and that's probably what you should be open to. So I understand it feels good to say, "F these agents, I don't want to pay anybody." But what my job here is to prevent you from making emotional mistakes with one of the largest assets in your life.
So I want to add two things, and you can answer this from CRMLS's perspective because you're their general counsel. If MLSs are not collecting concession amounts or compensation amounts in the MLS because they're worried about that from a strategy of further litigation, doesn't that harm potential sellers or appraisers? Or, I mean, doesn't that just cause a huge issue if you don't actually know what was paid out in a real estate transaction? Am I off on that?
You are not off on that. And every piece of data, everything that's collected, there's always, with any decision or policy you make, there's always risks and rewards. Okay. And it's our job at the MLS level, if you have good leadership in your MLS, to weigh those two risks and rewards against one another and making their decisions on what type of data fields and things to have. Okay. The risk with collecting concessions, obviously we're not going to collect compensation past August 17th because it's not going to be offered anymore.
Right.
Right. So the alleged risk of collecting concession information is this concept that people will look at concessions and say, well, since that's what everyone's paying, that's the marketplace, so therefore buyer, make sure this is what I signed for. I consider that a very minimal risk. I actually have data to prove that that's not how our concession fields are being used. We can get to that a little bit later. Against the reward, and the reward is huge here in collecting this data post-close. And that is, if you want this consumer-centric approach to work, then I, as an agent, as both the listing agent and the buyer's agent, I need the data to know what was the components of that transaction.
Right.
Right. So that I can give good advice to my seller and to my buyer on what kind of offer to make. Right. And how to approach and put a transaction together. I need, and I must have that data. The consumer-centric approach, I would actually break it down if I can't separate a list price into its component pieces. Mm-hmm. Right. As an example, what happens if the seller gave a $15,000 concession for roof repairs? Clearly, if I'm working at another property down the street, I would make that adjustment, or I'm giving horrible advice.
Right.
Let me give you another example that's not property related that I've seen recently. I saw a listing in Corona, the area that I used to work, where the seller was advertising the assumability of a 4.1% loan. Mm-hmm. And they were asking $50,000 more than any model match home in that development. Now, I don't know if they'll get 50, but are they going to get 25 or 30 grand more?
Probably.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Because it was coming with a 4.1% loan instead of a 7.5% loan. That has value in the marketplace of doing a transaction.
Yeah.
Right? So the same thing happens if a seller is saying, look, I'm going to pay for your title, your escrow. I'm going to buy down a loan point by 2%. And I'm going to pay your agent fee. I need to know those things as an agent to properly give a client great advice.
Yeah.
So the reward so overwhelms this tiny risk that, people are going to see the same number and use that, which is laughable when you look at like CRMLS specifically. We have commission offers all over the place, right? There is no
standard.
No, I know. It's funny. I was just doing some of this on our own data, and just for other reasons. And I was looking at some of the offices and stuff, and the numbers are all over the place. Yeah. And what was offered publicly versus what was actually done at the end was completely different. I mean, it's a whole other conversation. I want to keep this going for time's sake.
I do want, because I know that listeners are going to want to know the answer to this. If I'm a listing agent and someone calls me on the morning of August 17th and says, is your client offering compensation? Right? How do I answer that question and not get myself, I want to do the right thing for the seller. I don't want to get in trouble. How do I answer that question? Because when those phone calls are coming, and so if you're asking me how I'm going to answer that question, is the only answer I can give you. I'm going to answer with, my firm does not share compensation. We don't offer compensation, and we will never accept compensation from another agent, period. Now, I have had a conversation with my seller about the realities of the marketplace, about the fact that a buyer is going to enter into an agreement to pay their own buyer's agent. And now this depends on what my client does. Sure.
Right? If my client said, yes, I'm willing to, my list price includes a certain amount of concession for me to help a buyer, then I will indicate that. If my seller said, no, my list price does not, I don't want my list price to include, I don't want to offer anything, I would tell that to the buyer's agent. Yep. And that helps the buyer's agent either way. It doesn't matter what the answer is. Because now the buyer agent can either make the offer and include their whatever the buyer needs, whether that's title and escrow fees, whether that's the buy-side buyer broker fee, whether that's loan points, whatever the buyer needs, they can put in the offer, and they can increase the offer price to accommodate or not, depending on my answer on what conversation I had with the sellers.
I just want to make a point here. What you're not doing is stating yes and an amount.
I'm not saying yes in an amount. Now,
you're worried about steering if you did potentially. So you're basically saying, paraphrasing, but put it in your purchase contract.
Write your best offer.
No, though, I'm okay with an amount. If I had a conversation with, so I'm going to put you guys back as sellers, but you have an FHA condo in Corona. Okay. I'm going to May of
on the beach though. On the beach.
I miss our beach. Corona's not on the beach. I miss I miss our beachfront home.
Because I got the data from Riverside County, so you're stuck in Corona. I want to use actual numbers. Right? What I'm going to tell you is, you're going to have an FHA buyer. That's by far the most likely buyer that comes to your property. They're going to only put 3.5% down. That buyer needs help. Way more help than just paying their agent. They need escrow and title fees paid. They need at least a percent to go to the origination points of their loan. So, and I can tell you in the average, sellers paid 1.8% to help those buyers get in the home. That is not going to the buyer's agent. That's for other costs.
Right.
So in that situation, my recommendation to you, looking at the data, is we say our list price. Okay, we're going to list this home at $500,000. This $500,000 has baked into it a 4% concession offer, right? A 4% that we're going to advertise that James and Keith are willing to help a buyer get into this property who offers $500,000 by giving back 4%. Now, you buyer, you decide how to use that 4%.
Right.
You can use 2% on an agent and the other 2%, on buying down your loan points and paying escrow and title. Hey, maybe you cut a deal at 1.5% or 1% to your own agent to represent you.
Right.
And we use 3% on those other costs, whatever you want to do. So I have no problem whatsoever with the communication of a specific percentage and a specific number in a concession, because as long as it is open for the buyer to use any possible way the buyer wants to use it, that is not steering.
All right, one last question for me. Keith can throw it if he wants, then we'll get to the buyer's agent side because that's where everyone's freaked out. What's wrong with this language? And you can tell me where I'm off. Our seller is willing to entertain any and all requests. Put it in your purchase contract.
Nothing.
There's
nothing wrong with that.
We're just basically saying we're willing to entertain any and all requests. Put it in your purchase contract.
Nothing wrong with that.
Yeah.
And let me give you some numbers to do that. You guys know CMLS already has rolled out our concession and price field.
Right.
This is live right now at this moment. 1,331 listings have had some kind of advertisement of a concession. 51% of those did not specify any number. They did, James, exactly what you said.
Seller's open to it.
29% had a percentage. 20% put a dollar amount in, not a percentage. And by the way, all 1,331 listings have a full offer of compensation, have something in the buyer agent compensation field, because that's still live in CRLS till August 13th. All of them are still making a full offer of compensation.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. So this idea that it's a replacement, the data suggests the exact opposite, that this is in addition to offers of compensation.
So Keith's point, seller cares about net.
Yep.
They're going to care about net. You adjust your strategy somewhat based upon market conditions, potential buyer.
Or property.
And then, or property. Yep. So we have all those in there. And then my sort of overarching theme is you can also just say, we're willing to entertain any and all requests, put in your purchase agreement.
Yeah.
And it's just the seller, the buyer's agent calls you, says, are you willing to offer compensation or concessions?
Maybe.
Our seller is willing to entertain any and all requests, put it in your purchase contract. Like, you can just play it from that standpoint and let all the offers dictate your strategy and response, correct?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Keith, miss anything? We good on that?
Yeah. No, I just want to put just like a bow on it one more time. Like, I hear a lot. Whenever we talk about this, I'm sure it's true for the two of you as well. I get a million what about questions. Like, what about this? And what about that? What about this? And what about that? And they get so frustrated because my answer is the same. Relax. You're going to figure it out on offer day. Right. Like, we have pushed this conversation around buyer compensation to offer day. And your strategy could change if you're the buyer's agent. It could change with the client. We'll get to that in a minute. But as a listing agent, in my opinion, the best thing you could do is communicate to them what is important to the seller, timeline, right? And then usually, obviously, one of the most important things is seller net. And my shorter version of what James has said is obviously there are these two or three things or whatever's important to the seller. One of those is seller net. So make sure you write your best offer. And that's it. Like, it doesn't have to be so complicated.
I don't like, to me, this is just negotiation 101 to a degree. It's just like to me, it's always funny of why would you advertise what you're willing to do in advance of somebody making an offer first? Like, not to be harsh about it, but it's like, just tell me what you want and then I'll negotiate. I don't go to buy a car and the dealer goes, we're willing to go down to this price.
But there might be a situation where a seller really wants to make sure if someone buys a condo, buy my condo, so I'm willing to do it. Just like to your analogy, the car dealership might run an ad on the car that they want to get, move out of the inventory, right?
Right. And if you think about the car industry, and we'll move on to buyer side here, over the past, until about a year ago, the car industry was on an explosive growth. They couldn't keep cars on the lot, if you remember. They also weren't advertising any incentives. They didn't need to. Like, you went there and you made your best offer and you negotiated, you haggled, and then you get whatever car you want. So, all right. Keith and I are buying a beachfront property in Hawaii.
Yes.
And you're invited, Ed.
Lakefront in Tennessee, so I can represent you.
Okay,
fine. We're buying a lakefront property in Tennessee.
I do like Nashville.
Keith, fine. We're buying a beautiful place in downtown Nashville. And you're meeting with us. First question, mandatory buyer rep agreement, and we're looking for an agent. Start us off there. What is your conversation about how we're going to work with Mr. Ed Zorn?
What we're going to talk about is that I only work with the written agreements. That's a requirement. So realize any real agent who is following the rules and code of ethics is also going to have you sign an agreement before we actually go tour any properties.
Okay.
And if they don't, then they're violating a number of very important rules that are designed for your protection. And you may want to contemplate whether that's the kind of individual you'd like to work with. I am this again. I'm going to talk about me. Okay. I am going to present you with a non-exclusive agreement. And I'm going to explain to you, this is the fee that I charge. And by the way, I signed 2 buyer rep agreements last Friday. Okay. So I'm doing this stuff.
Yeah.
And this is the fee I charge. And here's the services I'm going to provide for that fee. Now, under the current system, what we're going to do when it comes time to make the offer, we will request in our offer that the seller pay us that fee. And I'm going to show you every property you want to see. And we're going to put an offer in with that request on any property you think you would like to have, period. It does not matter to me what the listing agent says as far as whether they're offering something, whether that be advertising a concession or not, or making some kind of offer compensation. We will put in the actual offer that we make that amount, and then it will be subject to negotiation. So either we have a good listing agent who has properly prepared their seller to understand this process, that we will be including this request in our offer, and that was factored into the list price, or not. Maybe they didn't. But I will use comparable properties, and I will use my negotiation skills on your behalf and my ability to properly value a property to fight for you to make sure the seller ends up getting a price that's satisfactory to you that would then cover the fee.
I want to go first. So I think you said that you would use a non-exclusive agreement. Can you unpack that?
Yes. I am going to be in competition with other agents. Mm-hmm. And I understand the reality of, if we've just met, you don't know much about me, that why should you commit to a month or 2 months and you don't know if I'm any good? I'm comfortable letting my skill and my ability speak for itself. Now, my non-exclusive agreement is going to still protect me, so that if I am involved in a property, called broker involvement, right? Mm-hmm. If I am involved in the property, which is showing it, preparing CMA and negotiation strategies, or making an offer on it, right? We do one of those kinds of things, then I expect to be paid, and that's what my contract's going to say. Now, mm-hmm. if we just talk about properties and I send you some things off the internet, right? I don't expect a commission at all for that. It's only where I'm actually involved in you acquiring this property, then you're gonna pay me. But if after a weekend we go tour 3-4 properties and we're not hitting it off, we're not communicating, I want you to go somewhere else. Mm-hmm. I'm totally comfortable with you going somewhere else the following weekend. But if you want to buy one of those 3 or 4 homes, then you've agreed to use my services on those homes, and I will be receiving this fee that we discussed on those homes. But if we're not meshing, then please, it's important for you to get the right house for you. And if we don't communicate right, then I want you to have the freedom to go somewhere else.
So if I'm reading this, we're gonna see sort of an all-out, not chaos, but companies are going to be fighting for non-exclusive and exclusive agreements. They're going to be training their agents for that, and those pitches are going to have to be very dialed on why a buyer would want to sign an exclusive contract versus non-exclusive. What I fear is that these agreements are not going to be clear, and a buyer is not going to understand what they're signing, and we're going to deal with a lot of litigation here. Am I wrong with this statement?
Probably not, but it will work its way out after about a year, because what's going to happen is the guys with the brokerage firms with crappy, confusing, horribly consumer things,
non-consumer protection. They're
going to lose market share.
Right.
This is a market share issue, guys. Right. Everybody has to go to the marketplace with their agreement and lay it down in front of a buyer. Mm-hmm. The easier it is for that consumer to understand that, the clearer it is, your ability to explain that, and hopefully barely have to explain it because your written document is so clear, it's easy to understand.
Yeah.
I think
these 8-page, super broker-centric, no matter what happens, I get to own you and your first child.
then I get paid no matter what. Yeah.
No one's going to sign those.
I do think what I like, whether you choose exclusive or non-exclusive, I love your approach and your thoughtfulness around, and this is at the core of what we do, which is if you aren't happy, you shouldn't work with me. And if you do, in my opinion, if you do an exclusive agreement, then you better make it very easy to get out of, right? So like I might feel like I am fine. I'm just like you. If it's not clicking, let's shake hands, part friends, and I'll see you at the farmer's market or whatever, right? I don't know why I said that. I never go to the farmer's market, but I would rather sign an exclusive agreement so that you tell me, because there is also very often you meet somebody, you look at houses a few times, and then they drift away, right? And I just want you, if we're going to break up and it's not jiving, if I don't check with you, we need to have that conversation. Let's break up. Let's officially break up. So I think, but it all anchors into that same point of no, you better not be trying to craft an agreement that sticks people into working with you, right? Because you will lose market share. Period. End of story.
What do you do when, how do you get around the conversation of talking about your compensation, your fee, and basically saying they have to pay it if the seller's not willing to offer any type of compensation or concessions? How do you have that conversation?
So what I recommend to people now is, how do you have that conversation today? Because the question you just asked me has nothing to do with these settlements.
Right. The
Right
answer
now,
though is
CMLS has 661 listed properties with 0 compensation on. So if you're an agent on one of those 661 properties, what are you doing now? So this is a good question, but I just want to frame it appropriately.
Yeah.
That is today. That is not a litigation change.
Agreed. And I would answer it, but you're the guest, so you answer it.
So my answer to that is, you can only afford the property you can afford.
right.
Period. And one of the pieces of what we're going to do by putting and requesting that the seller pay the fee that I'm charging as the buyer's agent, right, is we can make an adjustment to the purchase price to accommodate whatever you can afford.
Mm-hmm.
But if the seller still says no, and this is where my skill in valuing the property and negotiating come in. This is where higher value agents should be able to actually command a higher fee, right? This is where my skill shines, because I'm going to submit a CMA to the listing agent that says, hey, look, we put in a good offer and my fee is included. And when you look at these 3 comparable properties, we are within the range of those 3 comparable properties. And on those 3 comparable properties, every single time the seller paid for either the buyer's agent or some of their concession amount, and we're within those ranges. So your seller's being unreasonable in not taking this deal. I am going to put that CMA together. I'm going to craft that email. And if it still comes back, no, right, I'm a seller, and what I want is overvalue, right? I want more than anyone else has gotten. And even though everybody else paid some of the buyer's fees to get in, I'm paying 0. You know what? Sometimes you have unrealistic, we've all had them. We've had the jerk seller, right, who's completely irrational.
Yeah.
Look, I go to my buyer and go, you know what? I don't think this deal's probably going to close anyway, because an irrational seller is hard to get a deal closed, but it's up to you, buyer, right? Do you want to pay the extra money or not? Just change your offer price.
Right.
And then the answer that most agents will say is, what if it doesn't appraise?
So again, in my example, it'll always appraise, right? Because in my example,
he's provided a CMA.
I've provided the CMA that shows what our offer is within the parameters of making those adjustments for concessions or compensation that was paid by the seller. So in my example, there should be no appraisal problem. But again, if you're in a seller's market, properties are going up a little bit in value, we all deal with that all the time. You know what, guys? If it doesn't appraise, it doesn't appraise.
And you figure it out.
Then go to a different property.
Yeah. And the same thing would be if I'm competing with a bunch of cash buyers and, you know, they're offering to pay their agent's compensation. The seller didn't want to offer any, then they're not competitive. I mean, the answer is the same. That was 2021.
Right.
So,
yeah. I mean, look, if it didn't, I guess what I feel like people are doing a lot is because of this change, and all humans hate change that is change, period. And they hate even more change that is forced upon them. So I understand the emotion of the moment, but what happened a year ago when your property did not appraise? You worked it out. You tried your hardest. If it missed, but you did a rebuttal. You did all the things you used to do when a property didn't appraise. You're going to do now to try to get the property to appraise. And yes, in the history of ever, have agents taken a haircut to get something done? Yeah, all the time. And you might do that now or in the future. Like this, everybody just got to take a breath. Like yes, there is some difference in how we're going to be doing things, but most of the answers really anchor back into the same approach that we've used historically, and the paperwork's going to be different. The approach will be different. I'm not being dismissive of the change, but I think somehow we think this has affected every single step of the entire process, and it's just simply not the case.
So question, I've got two more before we wrap up here. So talk to us about how you structure, well, actually, let's do this. So tell us about the difference between requesting that the seller pays your fee through the purchase agreement versus a concession towards the buyer's closing costs. Is there an advantage or disadvantage to one or the other? Do both? Like, what would be your strategy on that?
My strategy would be straight up and tell the seller in the purchase agreement, right? In the offer, it would say seller to pay Ed Zorn Realty X% of the purchase price at closing.
Yeah.
Here's why I think that's important to separate it out and not just say to pay X% of closing costs. And that is, in the current lending environment, we all know now that Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, FHA, right? Everyone has agreed that the seller paying the buyer's agent is not an interested party contribution.
Right.
Okay.
And why is that? Because that's traditional. That's historical. Right. That's what we've been doing. We want to maintain that, right? So we want deals closing where the contract says the seller is paying the buyer's agent. We want it to show on the closing statements that lenders are looking at, that Fannie Mae is approving, that the seller is paying the broker for the buyer directly on the seller's side, right? So that's why I wouldn't just do like an overall just blanket closing cost, but I would specify it out. I also think it's more transparent, right? It's easier for the consumers to understand what's happening with commissions when it's not pre-packaged or included in some kind of big bubble of all kind of things together. So those are my two rationales as to why I would separate those out.
So in your structure, you would have the commission clearly defined and then any concessions clearly defined. Is that correct? If they were asking for both.
Correct. And to me, it's terminology ends up, it still ends up being a seller concession, even though it's not applicable to IPCs from a lending perspective. But yes, I'll be frank, I would always separate out any concession I ask for. I would separate a loan point. I would separate out a payment of a title fee or a lawyer or an escrow dollar amount. I would specify specifically, roof repair credit of X or home improvement. Right. That's just my style. Sometimes people may want to individually negotiate certain.
So a question that I'm getting asked a lot is people are saying that, people say a lot of things, by the way. People are saying that the Department of Justice is not gonna like that either. That they do not want the seller paying the buyer's agent's fee as well. I personally have read the opposite, but I mean, what's your understanding of that?
I read the same paper you read, which is the exact opposite of that statement.
Yeah.
In the no select case versus MLS PIN, in the statement of interest filed by the Department of Justice, they specifically used this exact example, that it is perfectly okay for the seller to pay the buyer's agent in the transaction. So I don't know who's making that argument, but it's against the written statement of the Department of Justice.
I've read the same statement you did. Yeah.
The framework we've discussed all day here is exactly what the Department of Justice has been asking us to do. which is don't make an offer of compensation. Have the buyer at the beginning of the buyer and buyer-broker relationship to set a fee between the two of them, and then include that in the offer so it becomes part of the purchase price between the seller and the buyer directly. So the principals, the buyer, seller, the consumers get to negotiate the terms of that contract and how compensation fits into that contract. So again, that's why we call this the consumer-centric approach versus brokers sharing, over there with the two brokers having a side agreement, over there outside the consumer's transaction. Right?
Yeah.
So I see no criticisms from the DOJ in relationship to this kind of a mechanism. And I would argue even, James, that the concessions, right? I hear some criticism on the concessions.
I was about to ask that. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'll let you ask your question first and see.
No, I was going to say, people are saying that concessions they're going to have a problem with. So I'll lead you into the answer. Yeah.
Correct. And we know from what CRMS has already done with the 1,331 listings we already have that have offered concessions. By the way, guys, almost 24 of those offers of concessions were 5%. Remember, those 5% deals also had an offer of compensation in them already.
Yeah.
All 1,331 of these concession advertisements all have offers of compensation already. And 5% makes sense, right? If I'm selling a condo, right, the cap is 6% for an FHA.
Yeah.
So it makes sense that 5% is a number for a concession in addition to offers of comp. Right?
Well, also,
it's not.
You can't restrict the seller from offering a concession to a buyer. There's nothing to do with an agent in that. By the way, for context, because I've talked to many other lawyers, that would actually be a restraint of trade.
Correct.
Do that,
right.
Which is an antitrust violation, ironically. So, Ed,
I see no criticism from the DOJ going against the concessions in light of the statistics and the evidence of actual data that we have in place right now today that dispels this fanciful thinking that a concession is just some kind of replacement of compensation. Nothing can be, the evidence of the actual data shows the exact opposite.
Ed, this was really helpful. I know everybody here who's like trying to figure out what to do just got a masterclass on how to talk to your seller and or your buyer. I hope everyone understands that this isn't as complicated as maybe it sounds. There's sound logic in all of that. We really appreciate you being here. I hope that associations are listening on the forum stuff too, so that we're moving away from potential litigation. I know I speak for a lot of us in the $2 billion club that we'd like to stay away from more litigation. So again, we really appreciate your time, and I'm sure we'll have you back for another episode of what's happening in residential real estate. So thanks, my friend. Appreciate it.
Appreciate the opportunity to share. Thanks.
Thanks for joining us for today's podcast. Subscribe now so you never miss an episode.